kiddos, we are back again, and today we are going to dig into chapters 19 through 22. So I'm on page 83 if you want to join me, and what we're going to be focusing on today is character traits. Now kiddos, this is something that we should be very familiar with. We started learning about character traits way back in August, and it's something that we hit really heavy on when we came back from Christmas. Remember, we talked about it through all of our Greek myths, when we talked about Jason and Perseus when he was fighting Medusa in the myth. And we talked about it with, remember Echo and Narcissus. We spent a lot of time talking about character traits, and we also spent a lot of time talking about it with the lightning thief. Okay, so we know that character traits is when we describe how a character is feeling. Okay, so I put some words up here to kind of jog your memory because I know it's been a little while. And I know usually you guys have a piece of paper in your reading journal that gives you words that you can choose from. And you don't have that with you today, and that's okay. So I'm giving you some words here to kind of think about. So ways that we could describe character: angry, sad, lonely, joyful, brave, scared, friendly, or upset. Those are all ways that we could describe characters. And I want to jog your memory about how to describe characters. We know that when we describe characters, it's usually an inference. Very rarely does the author come out and say, so-and-so is scared. Okay, very rarely does it say that. We have to make a guess. Remember, an inference is an educated guess. We had to guess that the character was scared. And we do that by asking ourselves these questions. And you know them, how a character is what? Thinking, acting, feeling, speaking. What we're going to focus on today is describing how they're feeling. Okay, we want to make an inference about how they're feeling. So how we're going to do that is we're going to ask ourselves, how is Zero, that's who we're going to focus on today, how is Zero thinking? How is Zero acting? What words is Zero saying? And when we think about all those things, what can we infer about how Zero is feeling? Okay, so that's kind of our essential question today. How is Zero thinking, acting, and speaking? And what does this tell us about him? Think about, what is he feeling? Okay, so we know what character traits are, and so as we read today, I want you constantly focused on Zero, and I want you going through our motions: thinking, acting, feeling, speaking. Find some clues. If you find a clue in there about how he's acting, pause the video, go type that into your graphic organizer. If you see a clue about how he's speaking, pause the video, go type that into your graphic organizer, okay? So I do recommend that you read along with me today. That way you can find some text evidence to type into your graphic organizer. So I'm on chapter 19. Let's kind of do a recap. Remember, Stanley found the golden tube with the KB on it in the heart, and he gave it to X-Ray, right? Because X-Ray is the leader of the group, okay? We had a discussion question about why do you think they always line up a certain way, and it's definitely because X-Ray's in charge, right? X-Ray's the leader. So he gave X-Ray the tube, they showed it to the warden came out, and they, instead of digging one hole each, they were digging huge holes all together with wheelbarrows sifting through it. Obviously, the warden was looking for something, okay? So last time we talked about the warden's motivation. What does she want? And we know she wants something. Something is buried in Camp Green Lake that she is searching for, and she's using those boys to find it, right? And so that's kind of where we left off last time. At the end of chapter 18, they kind of all were digging their own holes, and we find out that Zero doesn't know how to read, Zero doesn't know how to write, and Stanley's just kind of like, no thanks, dude. I'm not going to teach you. That's not for me. So we're on chapter 19, page 83. He was awakened one night by a strange noise. At first he thought it might have been some kind of animal, and it frightened him. But as the sleep cleared from his head, he realized that the noise was coming from the cot next to him. Squid was crying. "You okay?" Stanley whispered. Squid's head jerked around. He sniffed and caught his breath. "Yeah, I'm fine," he whispered and sniffed again. In the morning, Stanley asked Squid if he was feeling better. "What are you, my mother?" said Squid. Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. "I got allergies, okay?" Squid said. "Okay," said Stanley. "You open your mouth again and I'll break your jaw." Why do you really think Squid was crying? And why do you think he's coming at Stanley in such a really hard and mean way? Stanley kept his mouth shut most of the time. He didn't talk too much to any of the boys, afraid that he might say the wrong thing. They called him caveman and all that, but he couldn't forget that they were dangerous too. They were all here for a reason, As Mr. Sir would say, this wasn't Girl Scout camp. Stanley was thankful that there were no racial problems. X-Ray, Armpit, and Zero were black. He, Squid, and Zigzag were white. Magnet was Hispanic. On the lake, they were all the same reddish-brown color, the color of dirt. So one of the things that we're going to start seeing as we keep digging into our book is our author tackles the problem of race and how Americans tend to treat each other differently depending on their race. And Stanley was saying, here at Camp Green Lake, there was no problem. It didn't matter what color you were. It didn't matter how old you were. All that mattered is they were all there and they were all digging. And he said they were all the same reddish brown color, the color of dirt, right? Because they're covered in dirt all day long digging their holes. And so Stanley's saying on the lake, they're all equal. It doesn't matter if you're rich, doesn't matter if you're poor, doesn't matter if you're black, white, Hispanic, whatever your ethnicity, whatever your wealth, that didn't matter at Camp Green Lake. What mattered was that they were there together digging a hole, okay? And we're going to kind of see that come back as we keep digging through our book. He looked up from his hole to see the water truck and its trailing dust cloud. His canteen was still almost a quarter full. He quickly drank it down and then took his place in line. Behind Magnet and in front of Zero, the air was thick with heat, dust, and exhaust fumes. Mr. Sir filled their canteens. The truck pulled away. Stanley was back in his hole, shovel in hand, when he heard Magnet call out, "Anybody want some sunflower seeds?" Magnet was standing at ground level, holding a sack of seeds. He popped a handful into his mouth, chewed and swallowed, shells and all. "Over here," called X-Ray. The sack looked to be about half full. Magnet rolled up the top and tossed it to X-Ray. "How'd you get them without Mr. Sir seeing you?" asked Armpit. "I can't help it," Magnet said. He held up both hands, wiggling his fingers, and laughed. "My fingers are like little magnets." So I guess we know now why they call him Magnet, right? Magnet likes to steal things. The sack went from X-Ray to Armpit to Squid. "I'm sure good at eating something that doesn't come from a can," said Armpit. Squid tossed the sack to Zigzag. Stanley knew it would come to him next. He didn't even want it. From the moment Magnet shouted, "Anybody want some sunflower seeds?" he knew there would be trouble. Mr. Sir was sure to come back. And anyway, the salted shells would only make him more thirsty. "Coming your way, caveman," said Zigzag. "Airmail and special delivery." It's unclear whether the seeds spilled before they got to Stanley or after he dropped the bag. It seemed to him that Zigzag hadn't rolled up the top before throwing it, and that was the reason he didn't catch it. But it all happened very fast. One moment, the sack was flying through the air, and the next thing Stanley knew, the sack was in his hole, and the seeds were spilled across the dirt. What do you think is going to happen if Mr. Sir finds out that Stanley has his sunflower seeds? "Oh man," said Magnet. "Sorry," Stanley said as he tried to sweep the seeds back into the sack. "I don't want to eat dirt," said X-Ray. Stanley didn't know what to do. "The truck's coming," shouted Zigzag. Stanley looked up at the approaching dust cloud, then back down at the spilled seeds. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. When else was Stanley in the wrong place at the wrong time? When the shoes fell from the sky. What else is new? He dug his shovel into the hole and tried to turn over the dirt and bury the seeds. What he should have done, he realized later, was knock one of his dirt piles back into the hole. But the idea of putting dirt into his hole was unthinkable. "Hello, Mr. Sir," said X-Ray. "Back so soon?" "Seemed like you were just here," said Armpit. "Time flies when you're having fun," said Magnet. Stanley continued to turn the dirt over in his hole. "You Girl Scouts having a good time?" asked Mr. Sir. He moved from one hole to another. He kicked a dirt pile by Magnet's hole. Then he moved towards Stanley. Stanley could see 2 seeds at the bottom of his hole. As he tried to cover them up, he unearthed the corner of the sack. "Well, what do you know, caveman?" said Mr. Sir, standing over him. "It looks like you found something." Stanley didn't know what to do. "Dig it out," Mr. Sir said. "We'll take it to the warden. Maybe she'll give you the rest of the day off." "It's not anything," Stanley muttered. "Let me be the judge of that," said Mr. Sir. Stanley reached down and pulled up the empty burlap sack. He tried to hand it to Mr. Sir, but he wouldn't take it. "So, tell me, caveman," said Mr. Sir, "how did my sack of sunflower seeds get into your hole?" "I stole it from your truck." "You did?" "Yes, Mr. Sir." "What happened to all the sunflower seeds?" "I ate them." "By yourself?" "Yes, Mr. Sir." "Hey, caveman," shouted Armpit, "how come you didn't share any with us?" "That's cold, man," said X-Ray. "I thought you were our friend," said Magnet. "Why are all the boys going along with it?" Right? Stanley's obviously taking the blame for himself, and the other boys are chiming in, making it worse, right? Like, "Man, the caveman, like, you're so bad, caveman." Why do you think, A, the boys are doing that, right? And B, why do you think Stanley's taking all the blame? Mr. Sir looked around from one boy to another, then back to Stanley. "We'll see what the warden has to say about this. Let's go." Stanley climbed up out of his hole and followed Mr. Sir to the truck. He still held the empty sack. It felt good to sit inside the truck, out of the direct rays of the sun. Stanley was surprised that he could feel good about anything at the moment, but he did. It felt good to sit down on a comfortable seat for a change. And as the truck bounced along the dirt, he was able to appreciate the air blowing through the open window onto his hot, sweaty face. All right, kiddos, we are on the top of page 88, chapter 20. It felt good to walk in the shade of the two oak trees. Stanley had wondered if this was how a condemned man felt on his way to the electric chair, appreciating all the good things in life for the last time. So what that means is that sometimes prisoners, right, they have to go to the electric chair. And these are men that have done really horrible, unspeakable things, right? And so Stanley's saying, I wonder if this is what they feel like, right? That they're appreciating all of life's good things. So Stanley's saying that this is his moment, right? He's walking to the warden for certain death. Like he feels like this is going to be the end of the road for him. And he's appreciating all the good things in life for the last time before he has to face the warden. They had to step around holes to get to the cabin door. Stanley was surprised to see so many around the cabin. He would have expected the warden to not want campers digging so close to her home. But several holes were right up against her cabin wall. The holes were close together here as well, and were of different shapes and sizes. Mr. Sir knocked on the door. Stanley still held the empty sack. Yes, the warden said, opening the door. There's been a little trouble out on the lake, Mr. Sir said. Caveman will tell you about it. The warden stared at Mr. Sir a moment, then her gaze turned towards Stanley. He felt nothing but dread now. Come in, I suppose, said the warden. You're letting the cold out. It was air-conditioned inside her cabin. The television was going. She picked up the remote and turned it off. She sat down on the canvas chair. She was barefoot, wearing shorts. Her legs were as freckled as her face and arms. So what is it that you have to tell me? Stanley took a breath to steady himself. While Mr. Sir was filling the canteens, I snuck into the truck and stole his sack of sunflower seeds. I see. She turned to Mr. Sir. That's why you brought him here? Yes, but I think he's lying. I think someone else stole the sack, and Caveman is covering up for X-Ray or somebody. It was a 20-pound sack, and he claims to have eaten them all by himself. He took the sack from Stanley and handed it to the warden. I see, the warden said again. The sack wasn't full, said Stanley, and I spilled a lot. You can check my hole. In that room, Caveman, there's a small flowered case. Will you get it for me, please? She pointed to a door. Stanley looked at the door, then at the warden, then back at the door. He slowly walked toward it. It was kind of a dressing room with a sink and a mirror. Next to the sink, he saw the case with pink roses. No, saw the case white with pink roses. He brought it back out to the warden, and she set it on the glass coffee table in front of her. She unclasped the latch and opened the case. It was a makeup case. Stanley's mother had one similar to it. He saw several bottles of nail polish, polish remover, a couple of lipstick tubes, and other jars and powders. The warden held up a small jar of dark red nail polish. You see this, Caveman? He nodded. This is my special nail polish. Do you see the dark, rich color? You can't buy that in the store. I have to make it myself. Stanley had no idea why she was showing it to him. He wondered why the warden would even have the need to wear nail polish or makeup. Do you want to know my secret ingredient? He raised and lowered one shoulder. The warden opened the bottle. Rattlesnake venom. With a small paintbrush, she began applying it to the nails on her left hand. It's perfectly harmless when it's dry. She finished her left hand. She waved it in the air for a few seconds, then began painting the nails on her right hand. It's only toxic while it's wet. She finished painting her nails, then stood up. She reached over and touched Stanley's face with her fingers. She ran her sharp, wet nails very gently down his cheek. He felt his skin tingle. The nail on her pinky just barely touched the wound behind his ear. A sharp sting of pain caused him to jump back. The warden turned to face Mr. Sir, who was sitting on the fireplace hearth. So, you think he stole your sunflower seeds? No, he says he stole them, but I think it was... She stepped toward him and struck him across the face. I'm talking like a big full-blown slap, but instead of a flat hand, she slapped him like this. Mr. Sir stared at her. He had 3 long red marks slanting across the left side of his face. Stanley didn't know if the redness was caused by her nail polish or his blood. It took a moment for the venom to sink in. Suddenly, Mr. Sir screamed and clutched his face with both hands. He let himself fall over, rolling off the hearth and onto the rug. The warden spoke softly. I don't especially care about your sunflower seeds. Mr. Sir moaned. If you must know, said the warden, I liked it better when you smoked. For a second, Mr. Sir's pain seemed to recede. He took several long, deep breaths. Then his head jerked violently, and he let out a shrill scream, worse than the one before. The warden turned to Stanley. I suggest you get back to your hole now. Stanley started to go, but Mr. Sir lay in the way. Stanley could see the muscles on his face jump and twitch. His body writhed in agony. Stanley stepped carefully over him. Is he... Excuse me, said the warden. Stanley was too frightened to speak. He's not going to die, the warden said. Unfortunately for you. So, what kind of person is the warden? We've kind of gotten a little taste of her, right? But now we are getting to see full-fledged her wrath, her anger, right? She just slapped somebody in the face with rattlesnake venom on her fingers. Okay, that's a pretty intense thing. I'm on chapter 21, page 92. It was a long walk back to his hole. Stanley looked over through the haze of heat and dirt at other boys, lowering and raising their shovels. Group D was the furthest away. He realized that once again, he would be digging along after everyone else had quit. He hoped to finish before Mr. Sir recovered. He didn't want to be out there alone with Mr. Sir. He won't die, the warden had said. Unfortunately for you. Walking across the desolate wasteland, Stanley thought about his great-grandfather. Not the pig stealer, but the pig stealer's son, the one who was robbed by Kissin' Kate Barlow. He tried to imagine how it must have felt after Kissin' Kate had left him stranded in the desert. It probably wasn't a whole lot different from the way he himself felt now. Kate Barlow had left his great-grandfather to face the hot, barren desert. The warden had left Stanley to face Mr. Sir. Somehow his great-grandfather had survived for 17 days before he was rescued by a couple of rattlesnake hunters. He was insane when they found him. When he was asked how he had lived so long, he said he found refuge on God's thumb. He spent nearly a month in the hospital. He ended up marrying one of the nurses. Nobody ever knew what he meant by God's thumb, including himself. Stanley heard a twitching sound. He stopped in mid-step with one foot still in the air. A rattlesnake lay coiled beneath his foot. Its tail was pointed upward, rattling. Stanley backed his leg away and turned and ran. I feel like I probably just would have stood there and screamed. The rattlesnake didn't chase after him. It had rattled his tail to warn him to stay away. Thanks for the warning, Stanley whispered as his heart pounded. The rattlesnake would be a lot more dangerous if it didn't have a rattle. Hey, Caveman, called Armpit. You're still alive. What'd the warden say? Asked X-Ray. What'd you tell her? Asked Magnet. I told her I stole the seeds, said Stanley. Good going, said Magnet. What'd she do? Asked Zigzag. Stanley shrugged one shoulder. Nothing. She got mad at Mr. Sir for bothering her. He didn't feel like going into the details. If he didn't talk about it, then maybe it didn't happen. He went over to his hole, and to his surprise, it was nearly finished. He stared at it, amazed. It didn't make sense. Or perhaps it did. He smiled. Since he had taken the blame for the sunflower seeds, he realized that the other boys had dug his hole for him. Hey, thanks, he said. Don't look at me, said X-Ray. Confused, Stanley looked around. From Magnet to Armpit to Zigzag to Squid, none of them took credit for it. Then he turned to Zero, who had been quietly digging in his hole since Stanley's return. Zero's hole was smaller than all the others. Why do you think Zero dug part of Stanley's hole? This is one of those actions that we can talk about, right? How is Zero acting? Well, he went and dug part of Stanley's hole when he didn't have to. Okay, so I want you to be thinking about that as we go into our last chapter. Okay, this last chapter is really going to focus on Zero, and then we're thinking about how is he thinking, how is he acting, how is he speaking, and we're going to use all of those clues to help us make an inference about how he feels or how Zero is as a character. Okay, chapter 22, page 95. Stanley was the first one finished. He spat in his hole, then showered and changed into his cleaner set of clothes. It had been 3 days since the laundry was done, so even his clean clothes were dirty and smelly. Tomorrow, they would become his work clothes, and his other set would be washed. He could think of no reason why Zero would dig his hole for him. Zero didn't even get any of the sunflower seeds. I guess he likes to dig holes, Armpit had said. He's a mole, Zigzag said. I think he eats dirt. Moles don't eat dirt, X-Ray had pointed out. Worms eat dirt. Hey, Zero, Squid asked. Are you a mole or a worm? Zero said nothing. Stanley never even thanked him, but now as he sat on his cot and waited for Zero to return from the shower room. Thanks, he said as Zero entered through the tent flap. Zero glanced at him and then went over to the crates where he deposited his dirty clothes in a towel. Why'd you help me? Stanley asked. Zero turned around. You didn't steal the sunflower seeds, he said. So? Neither did you, said Stanley. Zero stared at him. His eyes seemed to expand, and it was almost as if Zero was looking right through him. You didn't steal the sneakers, he said. Stanley said nothing. How does Zero know that Stanley didn't do it? Why don't you think about that? He watched Zero walk out of the tent. If anybody had X-ray vision, it was Zero. Zero, wait, he called, and then hurried after him. Zero had stopped just outside the tent, and Stanley almost ran into him. I'll try to teach you to read if you want, Stanley offered. I don't know if I know how to teach, but I'm not that worn out today since you dug a lot of my hole. A big smile spread over Zero's face. They returned to the tent, where they were less likely to be bothered. Stanley got his box of stationery and a pen out of his crate, and they sat on the ground. Do you know the alphabet? Stanley asked. For a second, he thought he saw a flash of defiance in Zero's eyes, but then it passed. Defiance means, like, I don't want to do it. Like, if Zero doesn't know the alphabet, so instead of just saying, no, I don't know it, defiance would be him being like, so what? And, like, kind of getting angry about it, okay? But Stanley says it just happened for a flash, and then it passed. I think I know some of it, Zero said. A, B, C, D. Keep going, said Stanley. Zero's eyes looked upward. E, F, said Stanley. G, said Zero. He blew some air out of the side of his mouth. H, I, K, P. H, I, J, K, L, Stanley said. That's right, said Zero. I've heard it before, I just don't have it memorized exactly. That's all right, said Stanley. Here, I'll say the whole thing just to kind of refresh your memory. then you can try it. He recited the alphabet for Zero, then Zero repeated it without a single mistake. Not bad for a kid who had never seen Sesame Street. Well, I've heard it before, somewhere, Zero said, trying to act like it was nothing. But his big smile gave him away. The next step was harder. Stanley had to figure out how to teach him to recognize each letter. He gave Zero a piece of paper and took a piece for himself. I guess we'll start with A. He printed a capital A. Then Zero copied it on his sheet of paper. The paper wasn't lined, which made it more difficult, but Zero's A wasn't bad. Just a little big. Stanley told him he needed to write smaller, or else they'd run out of paper real quick. Zero printed it smaller. Actually, there are two ways to write each letter, Stanley said, as he realized that this was going to be even harder than he thought. There's a capital A, but usually you'll see a small a. You only have capitals at the beginning of a word and only if it's the start of a sentence, or if it's a proper noun, like a name. Stanley pays attention in his English class. Zero nodded as if he understood, but Stanley knew that he had made very little sense. He printed a lowercase a, and Zero copied it. So there are 52, said Zero. Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. Instead of 26 letters, there are really 52. Stanley looked at him, surprised. I guess that's right. How'd you figure that out? He asked. Zero said nothing. Did you add? Zero said nothing. Did you multiply? That's just how many there are, said Zero. Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. He didn't even know how Zero knew that there were 26 in the first place. Did he count them as he recited them? He had Zero write a few more uppercase and lowercase a's, then moved on to a capital B. This was going to take a long time, he realized. You can teach me 10 letters a day, suggested Zero. 5 capitals and 5 smalls. After 5 days, I'll know them all, except on the last day, I'll have to do 12, 6 capitals and 6 smalls. Again, Stanley stared at him, amazed he was able to figure all that out. Zero must have thought he was staring for a different reason because he said, I'll dig part of your hole every day. I can dig for about an hour, then you can teach me for an hour. And since I'm a fast digger anyway, our holes will get done at the same time. I won't have to wait for you. Okay, Stanley agreed. As Zero was printing his B's, Stanley asked him how he figured out it would take 5 days. Did you multiply? Did you divide? That's just what it is, said Zero. It's good math, said Stanley. I'm not stupid, Zero said. I know everybody thinks I am. I just don't like answering their questions. So I want you to think about what do you think Zero is probably thinking? Okay, the author doesn't tell us because we're seeing that even though it's third person, we're seeing it more from Stanley's perspective. So what do you think that Zero's probably thinking? How's he acting? What kind of words was he saying? And what does that tell us about Zero as a character? Okay, there are lots of words you could use to describe Zero. You could pick 2 if you want to. If you're torn, you're like, oh, he's this, but he's this too. Because no person is ever just one thing, right? But I want you to think about everything we talked about in chapter 22, and I want you to infer, what do we know about Zero? What does this tell us about Zero? How could we describe him? Okay, we're almost done. I'm on right here on 99. Later that night, as he lay on his cot, Stanley reconsidered the deal he had made with Zero. Getting a break every day would be a relief, but he knew X-Ray wouldn't like it. He wondered if there might be some way that Zero would agree to dig part of X-Ray's hole as well. But then again, why should he? I'm the one teaching Zero. I need the break, so I have the energy to teach him. I'm the one who took the blame for the sunflower seeds. I'm the one that Mr. Sir is mad at. You see how this is all in italics? This is because this is what Stanley is thinking. So because this is told from third person, so someone outside the story is telling the story, right? We don't get an inside look at Stanley's thoughts. So the author will write them like this, so that way we can tell like, oh, this is what's going on in Stanley's mind. This is what Stanley's thinking. He closed his eyes and images from the warden's cabin floated inside his head. Her red fingernails, Mr. Sir writhing on the floor, her flowered makeup kit. He opened his eyes. He suddenly realized where he'd seen the golden tube before. He'd seen it in his mother's bedroom, and he'd seen it again in the warden's cabin. It was half of a lipstick container. KB, right? We got that heart with the KB in it. KB. He felt a jolt of astonishment. His mouth slightly formed the name Kate Barlow as he wondered if it really could have belonged to the Kissin' Outlaw. All right, kiddos, we are going to stop there for today. Remember, your focus is on 0. Okay, chapter 22 is really where you're going to want to go back and look at that. There is a mini lesson on the next slide. Please watch it if you are struggling with the graphic organizer. Click present in the top right. So this is my screen. Present is up here in the top right corner, and it will play the video for you, and then you can do the graphic organizer. Message me if you need any help. I love you guys. I miss you guys, and I will see you again soon.